Okay, so this is going to be the lecture for lighting and kind of your introduction to RenderMan. Now, what I'm going to do is use the lecture project just to kind of walk you guys through like how some of these tools work. And the lecture project, just in case you guys didn't see that, back in the welcome letter activity, way down at the bottom past all these installs, you're going to see an area for downloads. Some of you may have already grabbed this, just because you were already on this page before doing all your software updates. But at the bottom where you see downloads, the lecture project is the one we're going to be doing in every single lecture. It's not required. I'm not grading this thing. You don't need to submit an image when you're done with the lecture. It's nothing like that. I just want to give you guys the ability to follow along with the same thing I'm doing. That way you can kind of get familiar with the tools before you even get to the lab. But if you just like to sit back, take notes, and just kind of watch what I'm doing, that's still totally fine. But this is the lecture project if you're interested. This guy right below it, the VSD project, that's going to be the one that you guys are using in the lab. So take care of this one. You're going to keep adding to this like every single lab, making a material, making textures, for maybe Photoshop, UVing something. Your renders will go here. So that you're going to be really building off that one VSD project through the entire month. All right. So I've kind of got 2017 already loaded up. And at this point, it sounds like most of you guys already have Maya updated. You've got RenderMan working. Now, if you notice when you get to the lab that something is broken, like RenderMan just doesn't work, there's an issue with one of your installs that we didn't catch before, obviously we do want to get that taken care of before we get too far. But what I'm going to do is set my project to the lecture project. And inside the scenes folder of the lecture project, there are two different files. There's one called lights, another one called materials. This one we're really just going to be using today. This other guy we're going to be using for kind of the rest of the month. But we'll start with this one, number one, lights. Just going to open that up. And we end up with something kind of like this. So it's a fairly simple scene. It's really just a bunch of objects kind of sitting in like a punch bowl environment. There's no lights yet. It's already a camera, so we have a camera established. Very, very similar to what you guys are going to be kind of seeing in the lab. And we just want to kind of get a feel for how we use RenderMan, how do we kick off renders, how do we control the render quality, and then we can build a few lights. So let's just start off by trying to do any render at all. Let's not even make a light yet. So there are a couple ways to do a render. If you kind of look at your shelf at the top, you should notice that you have a RenderMan shelf, assuming your plugin is loaded. If you don't see this at all, or if it doesn't work, you might have to go into the plugin manager and make sure it's turned on, just in case you didn't do that. But we have this giant RenderMan shelf, and the area we're going to be kind of focusing on for today, in this first week, are going to be these two buttons right here. These both start the render. There's different types of ways to start it. And we have some different options for lights, which we're also going to use. And over in this guy, sorry, not that one, this one, next to the lights, if you right-click on it, this is where we're going to find all of our filter effects. So eventually we will be going into here when we want to start doing those shadow tricks, like with the tree branches. But we'll come back to that guy later. Let's just try doing a render and just kind of see what happens here. So at the moment, I'm still kind of looking through perspective, right? And let me just see what happens if I click on that leftmost button called Render Current Frame. We're just going to hit it. Okay, and what I'm noticing is in the bottom, well, on my dock, you should see this little eye that's kind of bouncing. It's called it, which again is very confusing, the image tool. And inside of it, we're seeing a render. Now, the navigation in here is fairly straightforward. If you hold down Command and left click, you can kind of pan around the image and move things side to side. You can middle mouse wheel back and forth. Now, I know I kind of talked to some of you guys when you're just doing the install, but a lot of you probably don't have all the same sliders and menus that I do, because they're not all visible by default. So a couple things you might want to do before you get too far is if you want to expose all these other areas of the image tool, they're going to be, if you click on the image tool at the top in window, just kind of go through these guys. It's primarily going to be these ones right here. I don't even use all of them, but you can, like, I don't use the inspector very often, but you can turn on the inspector. These are the ones I typically use, though. Catalog to me is pretty important, because what the catalog does is it kind of shows you your list of renders, which is also just the C button for catalog. Just closes and opens that. A lot of these other guys here, like image tools, the monitor controls, all that stuff are just like your play blast, not your play blast, your time slider where you can kind of play through an image sequence. You got gamma exposure sliders if you want to make the image brighter and help you kind of see something. But as long as you've got the catalog open and you can at least see this bar of tools right here, and we'll kind of talk about what these do later. As long as you can see that and this guy and the render, you're probably pretty good. Most of these other ones at the top we're not going to use very much. Now, one thing that kind of happened here when I rendered with render current frame is we did get an image, so that's a plus. It means it works. But we're already seeing lighting information, right? Like you can see shadows are in the scene already, which is a little weird because we haven't even made a light yet, right? And if I look back in the scene, like I don't see any lights. Do you guys think you already know what's kind of going on? Like why we're getting something? You probably like dealt with something similar to this before with Tony. It's not like this isn't a bug or anything. Yes. Yeah, so even if you don't have a light in the scene, if you just like were modeling something, Maya and a lot of these renderers assume you still want to see it, because you know how like if we turned off all the lights in the lecture room, it would just be black? Like that's not very helpful. So what they have built into this is even if you don't make a light, when you hit render, it assumes you still want to see something. So kind of behind the scenes, it just makes this default light, which is really just a distant light, like think of it kind of like a directional light, that just sort of fills the scene with a little bit of information. But as soon as we make our first light, all that stuff we're seeing there is going to disappear. Now, one thing that kind of happened here with render current frame is you'll notice that it is from the perspective camera. It's whatever camera I was looking through. And if I look at this little button here, some of these guys, like all the ones with the little arrow in the corner, those are buttons you can right click on. So for example, like if I were to go to my light button and right click, like there are other options there I could pick from. Like what type of light do you want? And like IPR, what camera do you want to render from? What resolution should it be? You know, do you want the IPR render to update while you're doing things? This guy doesn't have any options. It's really just a bunch of very basic options for the button itself, but it's not like it's allowing me to change the camera. So if I wanted to ever use the render current frame and we're getting this, but you know it's not the right camera, what did we say before that we had to do to make sure it does render from the right camera?
You just go to that scene in your view.
Yeah, it's just make sure if you want to use this button here, because you guys will be using this for your final, but because it's always dependent on the camera you're looking through in your viewport, all you do is make sure that you're looking through the appropriate camera. So if I go to render cam, and now if I hit that button, you'll notice it starts a new image, and you can always go back to the previous one. You can see the other one's still there. I can click on it. I can see it. But now I'm getting a render from the correct camera. And this one's a lot better than Maya's render view, because you guys probably remember with Maya's render view, anytime you guys want to keep an image, you have to keep hitting that save image button, and then you have to slide through that dopey slider at the bottom to see them. It's terrible. This just makes a giant list. Every time you hit render, it immediately keeps a new image, or it saves your previous image, makes a new one, which is great. Now this does mean over the course of a few hours, this is going to get kind of bloated because you'll probably have a ton of images you've rendered, but you can easily delete them. Like if you've rendered it a couple times and you don't think you need these guys, just click on it, hit delete, it'll get rid of it. So the whole thing with render current frame is this guy right here will work, but it is using, like if I go to the render settings and kind of click on this sampling tab, that render current frame uses these guys right here. And we talked about this a little bit in the last lecture, but samples is essentially our quality. Like how many samples do you want in the scene to calculate a nice render? More samples means it takes longer, but the render is probably going to look better. And if we have less samples, if I start dropping that down, the render is a lot faster, but it's probably going to look terrible, right? So we're not really going to mess with this yet. We're just going to leave all this at default. Now there is another way to render though, called IPR. And you can kind of see that in the render settings, there's a completely different area for the IPR samples. So see how this one's set to 128? So it means potentially, if when I render it, it could do up to 128 samples in every pixel, which might be fine. Anytime you do an IPR, it's only using half that. So the IPR will render a lot faster. And this is going to be the one you guys use like 90% of the time you're working on your project. You will only be doing render current frame for your final render once you're just trying to produce that nice image for your turn-in. So we're going to focus more on the IPR for right now. So let me show you how the IPR works and why this is a little bit different. The IPR, when you right-click on it, I have options. So this one's kind of cool because even if you are in perspective, like I'm not even in the right camera, but because IPR lets me pick the camera, I can say render from the render cam. And if I do that and go back to the image tool, it's doing it. Like it's rendering from the right camera, even though I'm not looking through it. And this one will update as I change things. So if I make a light and start moving the light around, you'll see this thing immediately start trying to render the new light information. Like it'll change shadows, intensities, all that stuff. Now, one thing about the IPR is because it's waiting for you to do something. It's like just hanging out, and as soon as you move a slider, it's going to start trying to render it again. This can be bad because sometimes you don't want the IPR to always render. Like if you're in there modeling something, like taking a break from lighting, you probably don't want that thing to start kicking on again out of nowhere because that's going to slow down your computer. So if you notice that this thing is still updating on you, just hit escape. And as soon as you hit escape, that will cancel the IPR. Or you could just physically close out of the image tool altogether, and so it doesn't even do anything. But let's try making a light and just kind of see how that responds to everything. So over here, we have this light section. I'm going to right-click on that light icon. And we're going to start off just by doing a rectangular light, because you guys are going to use this in the lab. But a disc light's very, very similar. It's just a circle as opposed to a rectangle. But let's do a rectangular light. We'll click on it. You can see like it shows up in the outliner. Like there's my node. And if you look in the viewer, I mean, you can see it. And you probably already know exactly what this is going to act like because you guys have all used area lights before in shading and lighting. It's the exact same thing. This is still an area light. It's just in RenderMan as opposed to Maya. Now, I've kind of created a light, and I'm not really trying to match reference right now. We're just going to try moving things around and kind of watch what happens. But, if you were kind of following along with me, just put your light off to the side somewhere just so you can kind of eventually see it in the render. So I'm going to maybe move mine over here. I kind of scaled it up a little bit, and I just want to see what this looks like. So what I'm going to do is right-click on my IPR, and I'm going to tell it to render from the render cam again, now that we have a light in here. Let's do that. And oh, by the way, you guys are probably going to see the same error pop up. I don't know if you guys are getting that right now when you're doing it with me. Don't be alarmed. It's nothing. That doesn't affect anything. It still works. So now we're getting the lighting information from the new light. Now, because this is an IPR, and you can kind of tell it's pretty quick, it's already done. If I go to the light and then just simply load up the attributes, we have a ton of different things that we can potentially change on here. And this whole top area, like under basic, this is going to be the main section you guys are working in. And a lot of these you already kind of understand. We know what intensity means and color. Those are easy. Now, do you guys know what exposure does?
It opens the lens for more light.
Yeah. But when you do that, it makes the image brighter, right? Or whatever you're taking a picture of, that becomes brighter. So you're going to start noticing when you get farther into this stuff that there's a lot of like terms and attributes that do the exact same thing. Like intensity, value, exposure, luminance are all kind of the same thing. Gain, like they're all the same effect. It's just making something brighter. So I could go to the intensity, like we're at 1, and it looks, I guess, okay. It's kind of dark. So maybe I want to boost this up. Now if I go to intensity and type in 2, it gets brighter because the IPR is immediately updating. And again, you can see it's pretty quick. We'll go to 5. It's brighter. And eventually, through a little trial and error, if you keep boosting up intensity, you will get the image to kind of match what you think you're seeing in the reference. So the problem with intensity, though, is, do you guys remember when you were doing this with like your directional lights and your area lights before, how that number that you were trying to type in there seemed so completely random at times based on the light? Like sometimes you're using the number 2 and it looks too bright, and then other times you make like an area light and you're going into like the tens of thousands just to get it to like illuminate the scene. It's kind of the same thing with this. You might notice that this number can be a little tricky to figure out, and you may have to crank it up really high to see something. So there is another option here using exposure. Now let me just kind of reset the intensity back to 1. Okay? So when you put the intensity to 10, you're saying it's 10 times as bright. What this guy's doing, though, it gives you a very similar effect, but it's a little easier to get the number correct faster. So for example, if I do an exposure of 1, every time you go up 1 exposure value, you are doubling the intensity. So it's almost like saying the exposure of 1 is like having the intensity at 2. An exposure of 2 is the intensity at 4, and then 8, and 16. So just think of this like a way to double your intensity very, very quickly. So if I do 2, now it's doubled again. 3, doubled again. Now the nice thing about that is because you're not having to because it ramps up really quickly, you can kind of use exposure as a much faster way to get the intensity in the right spot. But these do the same thing, so I don't really personally care which one you guys pick. You can do whatever you want, but either of those will eventually get your render to the right intensity. And you can see we're getting something kind of like this, which probably looks okay. And maybe we want to give it like a color. I guess we'll just do that. I know you guys already kind of understand this stuff, but we'll maybe pick like a weird greenish color. That seems realistic. So you can pick a color. It'll change the color you want. I'll just kind of put that back to white for now. Now, do you guys remember how an area light works? Like as far as like what scale does to the light and what moving the light might do? Like if you move a light around, what are we going to start noticing happens in the shot? Yeah, shadows are going to change angle, right? Because you're moving the light source. You're going to see the shadows changing the kind of the direction they're coming from. That's going to happen. So I could even play around with that a little bit. Oh, I forgot to tell you guys one important thing. When you guys click back in Maya, a lot of you are probably seeing this image tool keeps disappearing. And it's like vanishing, and then you have to like find it on your dock and then click on it to bring it back. The reason it's doing that is because of this one thing at the bottom called window always on top. If this is turned off, and it is turned off by default, if that's off, every time you click in Maya, you lose the image tool. You have to click on it to bring it back, and I've lost the render again. So if that bothers you, and you want to see the render kind of sitting on top of your Maya, just go to this and hit T, or just pick window always on top. That'll make sure it kind of hangs out above your Maya and you don't lose it. So now it's always visible. But let's try moving the light. So I'm going to kind of scale this down a little bit so I can see it. And we'll go to the light and click back here. It's going to move it maybe back in the scene a little bit. And you can see the whole render is changing. We'll move it forward. It updates again. Now with the scale, Does scale affect the angle of the shadows? What happens when you make a light bigger? Yeah, softer shadows. And because you are making a bigger light source, that means it should also become brighter in the scene. Now that can have a few problems, so watch this. Let's say that you guys know that you need to soften or tighten your shadows. Like you feel like the shadow position is correct, and you just want to try to match the shadow softness. So I'm going to pretend for right now that looking at the reference, we notice that the shadows from this wooden pulley are too sharp, and I want to blur them a bit more. So we know that if we make the light bigger, that will blur the shadows. So I'm going to do that. Okay, we're going to go to the light. I'm just going to hit R. We're going to scale it. We'll just make it bigger. Okay, now let's kind of look at the shadows here. It probably is making it softer. It's kind of feathering that out a little bit. But what also happened in the process of doing that? Yeah, it made the scene brighter. Now, for a lot of you guys, that is going to be very aggravating because that now it means you're going back to intensity and you're constantly fighting those guys the whole time you're working on it. Thankfully, there is a way to prevent that from happening. So this might be one of the first things you guys want to do when you kind of jump into the scene and start lighting something. But if I kind of go back before I scaled it, when you look at your light, go down into the advanced section. And we don't have to worry about much of this, but one important thing under advanced is this normalize checkbox. So what normalize does is basically what it's trying to tell you is when you have that turned on, as soon as that's enabled, when you start scaling the light, it will not change the intensity. So that's a really nice way to keep the intensity locked from your light scale. So let me try doing that. I'm going to go to normalize. We're going to turn it on. Now, it's probably going to get kind of dark when I do that. Because now because I had already scaled it up previously, and that kind of made it brighter. As soon as you turn normalize on, if you feel like your render got really dark, that just means you need to go to your exposure and bump it up. But once you get that set properly with this on, you don't have to worry about messing with it again. So 4, let me try 8, 12. I'm just typing in numbers until something shows up again. We'll do like maybe 13. Okay, so I'm just bumping up my exposure. Eventually you'll see it. But now, because it's set and this checkbox is turned on, if I go back to the light, and I'm going to scale it up way larger again, which if I did it before, it would have blown out the scene and made it too bright. Let's see what happens this time. Scaling it up huge. And it's not changing intensity. It's blurring the shadows a lot, which kind of changes the gradients a bit, but it's not like it's dramatically brighter. And if I make it really, really tiny, this is almost like having like a flashlight, where now it's a really small scale. We get much tighter shadows, but again, it's still roughly the same illumination, same intensity. So there's that. All right. How do you guys kind of feel about just the light so far? Kind of makes sense? Pretty easy, honestly. Yeah.
When I do normalize, it actually stops.
Yep. Yeah, it turns black. So what you want to, mine did the same thing. Go to your exposure and start bumping that way up.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, that's totally fine. Yeah, just kind of, I would say what you guys want to do is honestly, as soon as you make your light, just turn on normalize immediately before you do anything. That way it's kind of set before you start moving the light around. All right, now let's kind of go into a few things with color temperature. This is actually kind of interesting. So before, when you guys have colored a light, like even with Mental Ray or Maya, most of you have probably been going into color. Are you like color sampling, or do you just kind of like randomly move the color around until it kind of feels right? Kind of both, some combination? Yeah, like that's still totally fine. There's a lot of like artistic work that goes with this because you have to kind of see the color and kind of match it the best you can. But the RenderMan lights have a really cool feature built into them called temperature. Now, if you guys are going to want to use temperature in the lab to match the reference, but if you're going to use, when you end up using temperature, do not use color because they kind of fight with each other, and it's usually you do one or the other. So what I would recommend is put your color back to white before you hit this guy, but once it's set to white, turn on temperature, and you'll see that a new little attribute has just appeared. Temperature. Do you guys know what this is? Because you can tell this obviously does not mean like Fahrenheit. That would be like the surface of the sun. That's a bad time. Like we're not doing 6,500 degrees. So what is this thing? This, you've actually seen this before. I bet you saw it in like high school, like maybe one of your physics classes or like your art studio. Does that chart look familiar? Yeah, this is just, it's coming from physics. This is kelvins. That's what the K is for. It's measured in kelvins. These are for just a black body light source. Think of it kind of like how a star works. Any of you guys watch any of like the Cosmos stuff, like Neil deGrasse Tyson? So stars illuminate stuff around them, obviously. And depending on the energy and intensity of the star, when it has more radiation coming off from it, that actually changes what color waves leave the star. And you kind of get this huge range of colors from these different stars up in the sky. So what color are the most intense stars in the sky? They are blue, which is weird because I think typically we associate hot and like bright as like a red color and like orange. That's not hot. That's actually the opposite. Lower numbers in kelvins, which are fainter stars, are warmer and red. When they get brighter, they start shifting into these blue tones. So you can actually look these up for different light sources. It's not just a star thing, but you can look up like 60-watt bulbs and go online to like Amazon or Target, find the light bulb. It'll break down exactly what the color temperature is, and you can start recreating light sources that you have around your home. So like if I wanted to figure out like what is the temperature of our sun, I could do that. So we'll just type in sun color temperature is right around like 6,500 or 5,500, depending if it's been daylight balanced for your camera. And if you change that number, you'll notice that the colors change in the render. So right now I'm sitting at 6,500, and we kind of saw on the chart, 6,500, I mean, it's not completely accurate, but 6,500 is somewhere kind of in this area right now, like just a little bit above white. Let's try changing it. We're going to do a much more intense, we'll pretend it's like we're in a different solar system with a different star that's much brighter, which we're going to go into blue. So if I do 8,000 Kelvin, you can kind of see how that color is starting to shift into a cooler tone. 9,000. It just gets richer and richer blue. And eventually, if you go too far, it just will stop changing. But we're getting a much cooler tone now. And if I go lower, like around 3,000, now we're starting to get into like light bulb territory. And a lot of light bulbs do have this color. I mean, you can kind of see that happening now in the lecture room. I mean, a lot of it's that kind of warm tone. But when you look up something like a soft white light bulb, because a lot of you guys have those soft white light bulbs all over your apartment, does your light bulb look like that? Because this actually is probably the temperature that's fairly close to like a soft white light bulb. But you can tell like that doesn't feel right. Like that would not be a pleasant time in anyone's apartment with yellow lighting everywhere. The reason it's doing that is because the Kelvin number is the filament. It's the light inside of it. You know how the soft white light bulbs have that white powdery shell around it? That's actually neutralizing the warmer color. So when the filament lights it up, it goes through that shell, and that kind of like causes the color to shift into like a white, so you don't notice it. But again, as long as you guys kind of like look up color temperature, you look at the reference, and you kind of understand warmer, lower numbers or warmer, higher numbers go into cooler tones, you'll be able to figure out what you need to do to match the reference. Now there are some colors that aren't included, like purple, green, but because those are not natural light sources. Those typically only happen through like a gel coating on something, or it could be like a gas that's being lit up, like a xenon or something similar to that. But this would be a really good way for you guys to try matching colors a lot easier. So you can just kind of let physics take over. You don't have to worry about always trying to find the color perfectly in here. So I'm going to maybe do more of just kind of a white color for right now. Let me just try going to around like 5,000. Yeah, we'll just do something like that for this one. I might make this just a little brighter. Let's do 14 exposure. All right. Any questions about temperature? So it's just kind of built in the light. Use it if you want to. All right. We got all that stuff working. Let's try doing a few things with the filter. So let me kind of go back to the documentation here and kind of show you what we're going to be talking about. So one of the lights you're making is a rectangular light, which is actually the thing we just did. But along with that light, there's this thing called a cookie light filter. And this is going to project that like a texture effect from the light source. So let's try that out. When you guys want to attach a filter to a light, what you want to do is you click on your light, just select it, and then up here in your menus at the top, it's that button that kind of has the little like black polyplane in front of the light source. It says Create Light Filter. If you right-click on it, this is going to give you a ton of different options for filters that you may want to use. Now, the only one we're going to be using today is the cookie, but you guys are more than welcome to kind of play around with other ones if you want. And like I mentioned before in the last lecture, if you do want to find out more information like how these work, what's the difference between them, if you hit that little question button on the end of the panel on the shelf, hit that guy. That will load up the help docs, and I can immediately figure out what all these are doing. So if I go to like RenderMan, let's do lighting, light filters. There's all those filters we saw on the list. Like I want to know how the cookie filter works. Like that's what you guys are doing today. Here's the cookie light filter. You click on it, and now we have a wealth of information on how this whole thing is going to work. But it's basically, just think of it like projecting an image from the light. Kind of like how the projector works, like how it's just blasting an image onto a surface. That's roughly what this thing does. So you can connect a texture into it. Okay. And again, if the help docs is that button right there. You guys should probably be using this like every lab. Okay. Let's try doing the filter effect. So again, make sure your light's selected. Right-click on your filter button at the top, and just click on Pixar Cookie Light Filter. Now, as soon as I've done that, you can see something changed in the viewport. The light is still there, but you guys probably noticed there's this other weird-looking kind of like these white lines shooting off everywhere. That's the filter. Now, it's kind of hard to select sometimes because the two things are sitting right on top of each other at the moment. But in the outliner, you can see they are different nodes. The filter is a separate shape. So this means if you click on the cookie filter, hit W, and just move it forward a little bit from the light, see how it kind of clicks? And you can see these little like weird white, like almost like a bounding box, showing you where this projected image is going to appear. So kind of think of it like having a light outside of a window, and you're just controlling the distance the light is from the window. And like kind of think of the filter as the window frame, and that's your light source. So if you move the window farther away from the light source, you can kind of see what that means the light's going to do. If it's a lot closer, the light fans out really wide. But if you push that window really far away, now when the light goes through it, it's almost kind of like focusing into like a beam. So I can get like a shaft of light effect doing it this way. But let's just kind of back that up a little bit. Now what you guys want to do with this thing is, since we're just trying to create some really basic like fake shadows on a few of the objects, we want to make sure that the filter is has the white lines overlapping with the geometry. Now, let me kind of go to the attributes in the filter, and we'll see what's going on here. There are going to be two different ways to use this thing. At the top, we can use the physical method, which is what it's already set to. There's another one called analytic. Let me kind of go to the render here, because you can see that the render is already kind of changed, because as soon as you make the filter, it comes with this thing called rat grid, like .text. It's just an image file. That's already connected to the filter, and you can kind of see that we're getting these really interesting looking like colored grid patterns from the filter. This is just what it starts with. We want to change that out. Now, one small problem here with the physical method is this one behaves physically correct, but the problem with it is when you're just trying to move a shadow in the right spot, you're constantly fighting the distance from the light and the scale of everything just to get the shadow to look right. Sometimes what you just want to do is just take the image and just slap it right where you want it and just walk away and just be done with it. So if we want to do this a lot easier, let's maybe not do the physical method. Let's just see what happens if I go to analytic. Now when I do that, you'll notice that, see how that box shape changed a lot? Let me go back to physical. See how it's not fanning out anymore? When I do analytic, this thing just looks like a giant cube, just kind of shooting out from the light. See how much more clear that texture is now? Because it's not trying to like actually blur it like it's physically correct. Now it just projects an image. This is acting like the projector right now. So as soon as I start swapping out my image, it will show up in the scene. This is a really cool way to get these really interesting light effects without you guys modeling all the objects to kind of create the shadows. So let me, let's kind of swap out the image, because this, obviously, we don't want that in the project. So over here, instead of rat grid, hit the folder. Let's go to our source images. And do I have it in here? I probably do not. Oh, I bet I did not include it. All right, so I forgot to kind of put this guy in the lecture project. It's in your lab project, the texture file. Let me see if it's in the doc. We might still have a link to it. Oh, it took it off the doc too. Yeah. If you guys have already downloaded your VSD project, it's like the one for the lab, the texture's in there and you can kind of find it there. I'm just going to do that real quick. At least I can kind of show you what it looks like. So this is not in the same project. I'm going to go back and find it in the other project. Yeah, it's this guy, tree cookie. It's just like a little, like an alpha. So with the tree cookie, I'm just going to load that in. You can see it's like a black alpha with white around it. Load that guy, and let's see what happened. That's beautiful. Let me move this guy. I'm going to rotate it and just kind of scale this up, because the tree might be off the box right now. Let me try turning it. So I'm kind of blasting it right at the geometry, and I want to see if that tree shows up. Okay. So you can kind of tell, like, I'm putting a new image. I'm moving it. I'm trying to like shoot this shadow effect on the side of the box. And you can tell that something doesn't look right. Like, what is going on here? There's a weird cutout right there. Sometimes when you guys are working on like your project, you'll notice that you do something where it doesn't quite update. This just probably means the IPR needs to be restarted. It kind of lost track of what we were doing. So I want to kill the IPR render and just try rendering this again. So what I'm going to do is hit escape just to stop it. So this is no longer rendering. I'm going to right click an IPR and redo the render from RenderCam. And let's see if it updates this time. There it is. And I can kind of see this corner of the tree branch barely poking in view. But once you kind of see it, I mean, you might have to play around with the position of the filter. But what I could do now is, like, maybe I want the tree branch bigger. Just take that filter, scale it up. It should. It's not going to change, of course. Well, that's nice. Yeah, usually it updates. Mine is not for whatever reason. Let me see if I hit IPR again. Are you guys seeing it update when you're doing it? Like if it is changing? Yeah. Mine's just being kind of finicky right now. It seems like I have to, for some reason, hit the new IPR button just to get this thing to like refresh. But when you're working on it, you should see the tree moving around as you move the shape. Let me try this again, see if it's still stuck. Yeah, my IPR is not updating with the filter for some reason. But I could restart Maya and it might work. I'm not going to worry about it though. But you can at least see kind of how it works. It's just lining up the shadow where you want. And I think that right there might be the tree trunk. I think it's just, oh, it's right in front of the camera. We just kind of widen that out a little bit, make it bigger. And that should put that part of the tree out of view. And I'm just, again, restarting my IPR over and over again. There we go. So, I mean, I have a couple interesting little twigs and branches showing up in here. And at least I don't have that obnoxious line shooting through the scene. So when you guys kind of do this on your project, it's connected to that light, but you have complete freedom to move that guy around however you want just to match up that tree branch shadow. Try to get it as close as possible to the reference. They'll take a little trial and error to do that. All right. Any questions about the filter? That's really the only thing you're going to have to do is like create it on the light, set it to analytic, load in your shadow image, and then play around with the placement until it's in the right spot. Now, the only other thing you may want to do is if you look at the shadow, see how sharp that is? Like that's a pretty intense tree branch. Like usually if you have skylight outside coming through a window and it interacts with the tree branch, the tree branch shadows are not that sharp. Like they're typically quite a bit blurrier. So if you do want to blur the shadows in the cookie light filter, just kind of start scrolling through it, and eventually you'll see there's an area called blur. And you don't have to mess with like all this stuff, but just that one blur slider at the top, you just kind of move it up a little bit. And let me see if this one updates. It probably will not. Yeah, oh yeah, I barely moved that up. Like it's only about a quarter of the way up, and I almost blurred the shadow out of the scene. Let's go down. This does not like my filter today. But if you guys do it, I'm sure you're seeing the tree branch sharpen and blur as you move it up and down. So just move that one slider right there. We'll do 0.05. So it's just a really subtle blur. There we go. So it's now just a little softer than it was before. So that's really all there is to it with the filter. Just get it connected, load in your image, play around with the position of it, try to get that as close as you can to the reference. All right, let's try moving on to our other light and this IES light profile. Okay, now to do this, we are basically going to be recreating this type of effect over here. We're going to get these nice little light patterns from it. Now for the lecture project, I think what I'm going to do is maybe throw a light on this dark side of the box and just kind of see if I can get it to make those same effects. So let's make a new Pixar rectangular light. So I'm going to kill my IPR. I'm just hitting escape to stop it. And I'm going to right click on that light button. We're going to do a new rectangular light. And what I want you guys to do with this thing is just kind of keep it maybe relatively small, like not as big as this guy, and just kind of aim it at the side of the box, like aim it directly at the side. It's kind of just a good way to see what this thing is going to do. So I just have a small area light blasting that dark side of the box. Okay, and I'm going to try doing an IPR. We're just going to see if this shows up. Probably going to be like a white light. Yeah, I just got this kind of faint patch of white hitting that side of the box. This is just another Pixar rectangular area light. So it's nothing too crazy. It's white. I haven't changed intensity. It's still small. But we want to try connecting an IES color profile to it just to kind of see how that works. So to do that, on this light, we're still going to use temperature. So maybe we'll do this, and I'll maybe do like 3,000 Kelvin. We're going to make it pretty warm. But if you kind of go just a little farther down here, and you'll see an area called light profile, this is where you load in your IES profile. And it's simply just a file that you pick. So I'm going to hit the little folder button, and if you kind of go into if you're in the lecture project and in your lab project, you're going to see there's a folder called IES profiles. I made this. And you go inside of it. These are all IES profiles. Now, on the right side, you can see this little preview. It's going to try to show you what it looks like so you know what these are doing before you connect it. But let me click on Area Light. Just going to single click and hit that button. Click to create. Do you want to create missing previews in this directory? Yes. Show me the previews. What do these look like? It'll take a second. There we go. That's one of them. That's the Area Light IES. Here's Bollard, Comet, Jelly. I have no idea where they get the name for these. Jellyfish. I guess that's somehow a jellyfish. Pear. I mean, the name isn't really important, but you can kind of see roughly what the pattern's going to do. So how they kind of fan out. You get these little interesting lines from it. Here's X, that one's kind of cool, X arrow, because you get these nice little shafts from that one. This is actually the one you're going to use in the lab. And there's way more than just these out there. If you do a search for like IES light profiles, you'll find a ton of these. They're used a lot in architectural rendering. So some of you guys may want to do that later on, where you get into like maybe someone wants to eventually build an office. He wants to figure out what the whole thing would look like inside. He wants to set up the lights, block out all the rooms. If you know what the lights are that he wants, you can look it up, and you might be able to find the IES profile for it, and it'll act just like the track lighting. Like it'll create all the same lighting effects from it. Which one do you guys want to use today? Just if you kind of scrolling through them, are any of these jumping out at you? Do you like? Scatter. That one's kind of cool, right? Now this is it from the side. So this is sort of like, this would be if the light was aiming downward next to the box. But you know how we're hitting it head on? We're like shooting the light at the box. What that's going to look like is if I pick front, it's going to do that. That's what it looks like if it's shooting head on. And so it's still a circular effect. You can kind of see how these guys are doing it in the lecture room. Like those are still circular, but the more you tilt them down, that's when you really start to see the actual arc of the light from the side. That's what it looks like. So let's try scatter light. We'll see what this does. I'm going to connect it. Our scene has exploded with light. Just in case, because these do have intensity built into it, but just in case this is an issue with my IPR having a panic attack, I'm going to hit escape. I'm going to try restarting this again, and if it looks like it's the same intensity, that was probably correct. Okay, so this profile apparently really is that bright. So that means what I want to do is on that exposure and intensity, I want to start dropping that down a lot, because that is ridiculous. So maybe on intensity, let me try 0.5. 0.2. 0.1, 0.05, and I could do like negatives exposure, like -1, -2, but you can kind of see that pattern is slowly starting to appear and kind of show its shape. 0.02, there we go. Okay, so I'm finally at least seeing something. It looks kind of ridiculous, but I'm kind of getting that pattern to show up. Now, one thing that's going to be really important as far as like managing render times is, you know how right now, like imagine you guys are in the lab, you're kind of focusing on just that one pattern and effect, but see how the IPR is trying to render the whole image still? does the whole image matter when you're like focused on one side of the box, right? Isn't that like a lot of wasted time, right? So we can fix that because RenderMan has a crop tool built into this image tool. Like I can tell it to only render very specific parts of the image. So if you ever want to do that, over here, if you look at your kind of menu at the top, there's like selection options. There's one called crop. If you click on the crop tool, just click it. What you do is then you marquee select the part of the image you want to render. Now it hasn't done anything yet, but if you have the IPR running, once you draw your crop, hit R. R is just a shortcut for render again. That will cause it to like update. But if I hit R, now see how the IPR is like only doing it within the crop. So now it's going to render way quicker, and I can get much better feedback on what that light's doing. I'm not rendering the entire frame. So it's just hitting R, hit that button for crop, draw your marquee where you want, and you can move this thing around anywhere in the frame. When you kind of see it turn bold, see how it's kind of lighting up, you click on it, you can just move it to a new spot, hit R. That looks good. Move it to a new area, R. And you can, if you kind of click on the edges of it, you can like scale it around, you can kind of scale it in. So I just do like only the pulley, like maybe I want to do something like that. R, now it's only rendering that one object. And if you ever want to be done with the crop, like maybe you're just doing it for one object and you still want to go back to rendering the full image, just hit the little X in the corner, that gets rid of it. And now when I hit R, it goes back to rendering the full frame. So I would really recommend practicing with that today quite a bit just to get comfortable with how the crop works, because that will help you out a lot. You're going to be using that the entire month to make your renders much, much faster. Now kind of back to the IPR, I'm going to drop this crop on the side of the box and just hit R to refresh it. I want to turn it downward to see the pattern. So I'm going to grab that light, I'm going to move it up, and rotate it so it's aiming kind of like directly down. And now you can kind of see, yeah, there's that light profile. There it is. And depending on like how low it is, you can kind of see the arc where it's starting. It's fanning downwards. But we try doing like a different light. Like that scatter one's kind of interesting. I'll try just another one. I think someone said pair earlier. We'll try pair. There's pair. Pair is a lot softer, but there it is. Kind of like your old Maya spotlight if you blurred the penumbra and the drop off quite a bit. Yeah, some fancy studio lighting maybe. I'll show you the one you guys are doing in the lab, which is X arrow. Here's X arrow. Now this one is a lot darker. It's not a big deal. It just means you just go back to your intensity and you maybe boost it up a little bit. But it still does, it's the same thing. It just, for whatever reason, that guy has a lower intensity built into it. But there's X arrow, which is also kind of interesting. And again, this works with temperature. It works with your regular light. It's just this extra file that's connected directly to the light to give it a more interesting effect. Do you guys have any questions about the IES profile? Feeling good? Okay. How's it felt using RenderMan so far? Just like making the lights, watching it update. Does it seem like it's been fairly responsive? Good. Probably better than Mental, right? Yeah. Yeah. You can. I haven't tried it, but yes, you can do this. I think it needs special software to do this. We're not going to get into that. Oh boy. Where is it? Let's see what this is. That is. Oh. This is a good website. Hello, 2005. Let's back up. Yeah, I'll do a little bit more research for you. But if you just do a search for like IES creation, IES generator, the main thing it needs when you kind of look up an IES profile, it basically needs this like it's almost like a two-dimensional like XY grid. You have to like draw like in curves and gradients how that's going to be created.
If you search generator and get to the second one, it's
And do that one?
no,
Oh, the one play. Oh, back up.
yeah, play.sys.com.
Yeah, let's do this one.
How it works. It's kind of a 2D representation of how you create it.
Oh, this is kind of cool. Oh, this is perfect. Yeah. So this one, yeah, this actually is kind of nice because you have all these options for your individual bands of light. And this is using like actual physics.
Probably not free.
Probably, yeah. When it looks this good, chances are you're going to pay for it. But if any of you guys do decide to pay for it, please call me over so I can play around with it at your expense. But yeah, would be how you could make that. And before, like, you could still do this stuff even without a profile. Like if you understand how the gradients work, if you actually use ramps on a light source, you can sort of fake it and recreate some of these same effects. All right, let's back out of all that. Okay, so we've now covered temperature, how the IES profiles work. Let's try making the dome light, which we did before, but this is going to be the equivalent of your IBL, just like an overall environment filler for everything else. So let's try that. So to do a dome light, it's not in this list right here. Okay, we're going to go to the next one over. It has a little sun. There's our dome light. Now, do you guys know what these two are, or have you kind of seen these before? Because they're also in Mental Ray. I don't know if you ever played around with those.
Yeah, they kind of just fake HDRI kind of thing.
Yeah. If you saw it, you probably had instructors tell you don't create it or don't click that button just because it makes a bunch of things, like extra nodes you don't want to use. But Mental Ray had something called Physical Sun and Sky. It was like right below that IBL button you guys were hitting. And what it does is it basically makes this giant IBL, like a dome for the environment, and there's a directional light. And when you rotate the directional light, it's like watching the sun move across the sky. Like, and if you turned your camera and looked up at the sky, you would see an actual sun moving overhead. If it gets lower, you'll see that dusky kind of orange and red tone pop up on the horizon. This whole thing updates and changes with how you rotate the light. So it's like an automated time of day setup. It's pretty cool, but we're not going to use that for the class. But just so you know it exists, this is an automated time of day setup for RenderMan. So if you're doing like an exterior shot, you want to do something super quick, rotate your sun, and you'll probably get something pretty good. We're going to make a dome light. The portal light, though, is really cool, though, because with a dome light, actually, first off with the dome light, what do you think the dome light is faking? Like in the real world, what would this be the equivalent to? Probably not the sun. It does do the sun, because that's usually in the image.
Would it be like the dirt and all the atmosphere and all that?
Yeah, it's kind of like just everything else around you that the light bounces off. So the main reason people use this is typically for skylight. Like, it's not just the sun, it's the sun lighting up the atmosphere. You have a lot of this blue fill light from the sky. That's usually where we end up using the dome light or an IBL. But a lot of times, too, you'll use these for like reflections, because if you don't have anything around the scene, like there's nothing for the objects to reflect, so you get like a lot of very dark renders. So it's also used as a reflection sometimes. But one kind of cool thing about the dome light and the portal light is, imagine you guys are doing an interior, like you're doing a warehouse, and there's only like a few windows in the warehouse, and you set up an IBL or dome light around it. How much of the skylight do you think is actually going to make it through the windows? Because you're an enclosed environment, right? Like this lecture room. Like the light will kind of get in through a couple cracks, right? Like through the glass. But you can imagine that because you're not really, a lot of the light is hitting just the walls and you're wasting all this render time on stuff that's not even making it inside of your room. If you set up a portal light, what it does is it's almost like putting a light outside the window and it feeds off the dome light. So whatever environment map you put on the dome light, the portal light uses that and then directly pushes the illumination through the window. Because when you guys did your shading and lighting projects, did you guys have a project where you actually had to put like an area light outside of a window to like make it look like skylight was coming in?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's basically what this is. So instead of you just making an area light, picking some pale blue color, you would just make a portal light, and as long as you get a dome light in the scene, the portal light just immediately uses that to light up your whole project. So they kind of work together. But we're just using the dome light by itself, not the portal.
So do you have to link those two lights, or does it do?
It's all automatic. Like if the dome light's in the scene, every time you make a portal light, it just knows to talk to the dome light.
Is there ever a circumstance where you would have multiple dome lights? Is that not a thing? I'm pretty sure.
You can do it. I would not advise it.
Yeah.
That's like saying there's like multiple skies above you.
Okay.
Yeah, you can do anything you want, but I would imagine that would cause quite a few issues with the lighting. Because I don't know how that would respond.
Yeah, that's kind of
yeah.
what I was thinking of.
Yeah, I wouldn't do that. But you could have multiple portal lights, all using the same dome light. So I've got my dome light, and when you look at the attributes, it's really similar to the other light sources. That's really one of the nice things about these RenderMan lights. You're going to see, once you understand one, you know how they all work. They all do the same thing. It's the same sliders, same control. I got temperature, color, it's all there. So what I'm going to do on the color map for the dome light, we're going to hit the folder, and I'm going to go to my source images and load in an HDR image. But in the lab, you're going to be using an EXR file, but it's still the same thing. It's just a really big, high dynamic range image that's floating point, 32-bit format. Has a lot of data in it. So let me just load this in, and you can see it. There it is. It's beautiful. Here's my nice image showing up on the dome. And I'm gonna get rid of this crop just for a second and try to refresh that. I'm just hitting R to update it. And I'm getting this kind of nice little fill in the back that's from the dome light. So it's adding a lot of like blue, because obviously this is just like a kind of a relatively clear day. A lot of that skylight is just hitting down into the scene. But we have trees and dirt, all sorts of stuff in here. Now again, like every other light, you could adjust this if you wanted to. If you think like the dome light's too intense, you could take the intensity, cut it in half. It fades out the dome light. So that's something you could always change if you need to. But really, like for the most part with the dome light, as long as the image is connected and it looks like it's working and you think it like feels about the right intensity, you're kind of done. There's not really a whole lot you have to do to it. Now, one kind of important thing though about the dome light, and even like an IBL, if you guys decide to use Metal Ray again later on, is the file format that it's using. So right now it's using something called HDR, which is high dynamic range. And you guys probably used those before with Tony, right? Like use HDR images. Do you know why you were using an HDR image, not like a JPEG?
It has more information that kind of tells where it's possibly better.
Yeah, it's got more data in it. You guys know kind of how 8-bit, 16-bit, or 32-bit images work? Like what's actually different between them?
It's just kind of stored the pixels, right?
Yeah, it's just storing numbers for like what the colors are supposed to be in like every pixel. And I know like probably what most of you at least know on like a base level is an 8-bit image sounds like it wouldn't be as good as a 32-bit image. Like higher numbers sound like it'd be better. What an HDR image does, because it's 32-bit, is like, actually let's pretend this is a JPEG. I'll pretend I brought this in Photoshop and saved it out as a 8-bit JPEG, which would be a terrible idea. But we're going to do that and pretend we did it. What this would mean is if you were looking at a JPEG version of this, it'll still look the same in the viewer, but when you render it, you'll probably notice it doesn't quite feel the same because you know how you've had people talk about colors with you before, how colors and numbers are all the same thing? Like every color is a number. So like what's the number for black? Yeah, 0. Yeah, black is 0. So if you look at white, what would the number for white be? Not 300. Nope. It's much simpler than that. 1. Yeah. 0 to 1. If I went to Photoshop and typed in just the number 1 for value, you're going to get a white color, and you can paint bucket it and do whatever you want. So we usually think of things being between 0 to 1. Black is 0, white is 1. 50% gray would be 0.5. But if you were looking at this as a JPEG, what this means is most of this image would definitely be between 0 to 1. Now you'll notice in the back here, there's this little guy poking out. What is that? That is our sun. What is the color on the sun? Well, it's supposed to be yellow because you can kind of see yellow here, but like that pixel right there, like what color is that pixel? Yeah, it's just white. That means the JPEG image would actually put the number set to 1 on the sun, which might not seem like a big deal, but let's just pretend you're in the HDR image. You are back here standing on the cliff, holding up a white piece of paper. Because when you look at you holding a white piece of paper, that white piece of paper has the number 1, right? That means that when you rendered a JPEG, according to what RenderMan and Maya thinks, it thinks that your piece of paper with the white color is the exact same intensity as the sun. Just think about that for a second. That doesn't even make sense. Like, you don't hold up a piece of paper and you're blinding someone. You can't even look at the sun directly without burning your eyes. So that means when you use a 32-bit image, like an HDR or an EXR file, the piece of paper might be 1, but what that file format does is it writes numbers above 1. So this means for an HDR image, that's not 1. That could be the number 5,000, which means when you render it, the light coming from that guy is way brighter than any other part of the image, which is exactly the way it should be because that is the sun. That should be the brightest point of the image. So that's kind of why these HDR formats are so important. It gives you 32-bit floating point data, which saves numbers above 1. You get a much, much better range of color. And we're going to kind of get more into that later on when we start getting into Nuke and doing our final renders in week 4. But that's kind of how that applies to this. All right. So I think we're kind of good with all that. Let me kind of go back here, make sure we didn't miss anything. We made our light, 3 key. I mean, really aside from that, it's just trying to figure out, once you get all the lights in the right spot and you think you're good, and obviously get us to critique it as you're doing it so we can kind of let you know if you're going the right direction. But after all that, you're really just producing a final render and then just saving it out, and then you can submit that. And a lot of you guys will probably finish this before you're out of the lab. So let's pretend we are doing the final render. Now, the whole time I've been doing this, I've been doing IPRs, right? And you can see they're all listed as IPR, and there's a ton of them. Oh, and I forgot to show you one cool thing about this, the image tool. There's something here called Inspector. You may have turned it on already, but let me show you what this does. It's kind of cool. So the Inspector, if I can let me dock it, is this little area off to the side. And when I click through the images, you can kind of see how it's leaving notes. See how it lists the render time automatically? I know how long every render took. 38 seconds, a minute 38, 48 seconds. It tells me the render time. That alone is pretty useful because now you don't have to write it down and keep track of it. The other cool thing about this is it's just like a text doc, which means You guys know how sometimes when you're like messing with sliders, you're trying to compare the render and just figure out like how something works. And I'm sure a couple of you have like these crazy notes where you're just trying to keep track of different adjustments you've made to like so you don't mess something up. You can actually leave notes on any render that might be useful later. So for example, maybe for this one, I was just playing around with that profile and I want to make a note on which profile I used. So I could go over here to the inspector, hit enter a few times and say IES profile is the X arrow.ies. It's like it's leaving that as a comment. So this means anytime I go back to that image, I know exactly what I was doing. And you could put down notes for like, here's me messing with my max samples at 128. I didn't like it. So maybe the next time you render, you try 256. You write that in your notes. And you can keep track of everything you're doing on every image. So that is very, very handy. Now, if you guys don't care about doing any of that, like writing notes down and keeping track of that, obviously you don't need to use the inspector. You can just close out of it or just remove it this way. But that's there for you if you want it. All right, let's try doing a final render here. So at the moment, if I hit 1 to 1, this is the true size of it, just pretty good size. Would you say this is an acceptable render quality, just looking at it? Probably not. I mean, I'm sure before you guys were just, were fighting grain just to kind of clean that up. That was probably fun. Now, what you want to remember though is because we're doing an IPR render, if you go in your render settings, remember the IPR was doing 64 samples a pixel, which was totally fine when we were working on it because we got through the project pretty quickly. When I do render current frame, it's going to use completely different numbers. So let me try doing render current frame. Now remember, with this one, I have to look through the camera. So I'm going to look through the render cam, and I'm just going to hit render current frame. I haven't changed anything. I just want to see if I were to kick off a final render, how is it going to look? And this one will take a little bit longer because it's using more samples. So it's a little slower. You can see even in the list, it looks different. It's not listed as IPR. And we have that little progress bar at the bottom, just like watching paint dry. So this is typically where students lose interest in rendering, is this part right here, because you lose your mind trying to clean stuff up, and it just gets boring waiting on a render, right? What we want to do is just figure out what those numbers should be really quickly. That way you guys can hit the render button and then walk away from your computer, watch TV, play a video game, go to Disney, experience life, do anything else but stare at the render for about 4 hours straight. So I don't need to render the full image and wait, 5 minutes just to know if this is going to work. I'm going to hit escape and stop it right now. Do you guys have any thoughts on how I could do this way quicker instead of me just hitting render and waiting all the time? Yeah. What you want to do is look at your image, figure out the worst part of the whole render. Where do you guys see, if I zoom in here, where would you say has the worst grain? Like right here? Yeah, that looks terrible, right? That looks, really all the shadows are pretty bad. Like all that looks awful. This isn't looking too hot. Like that's pretty nasty. But I do agree, like this part right here is unusually bad. It's kind of where we're seeing a lot of shadow detail. So what I could do is if I hit crop, just marquee over a smaller section. And what I'm going to do here is hit R to refresh the render, which remember is this guy right here, render again. Now watch what's going to happen if I do render again. It'll render the crop. You're going to see something bad also happens. If it ever starts, there we go. It's rendering the cropped region, but what happened? Like, why did I lose the rest of the image? It's not a big deal. If you don't mind that, you can just still look at this and kind of get it set properly. But I know a lot of you guys, when you do a cropped render, you still want to see the other stuff around it, right? I could not figure this out for the first couple weeks I was in RenderMan until I noticed at the top here, when you look through this little toolbar, there's a button here called Toggle Background. So let me just delete this image. We'll pretend like that didn't happen. What you do is if you do a really crappy render, like just kick off a render and just let it go for a few seconds, hit escape to stop it. Like, so I'm going to say I stop this render, hit the background button, and see how, like, when you toggle a background on a render, how that little icon changes to a blue. I can turn it off. So it'll toggle whatever your active render is as a background. As soon as you do that, the next time you hit R to like have it re-render, now watch what happens once it gets going. Yep, it's already doing it. It uses this as a background and it renders the other one on top of it. So you don't lose that other information at this point. You can turn that on and off as you need to, but that's the background button. Oh, one other cool thing too about this thing, you can even select objects through here. So there's one right here called Select Object Tool. This thing is kind of cool because if you have the render open, you hit the Select Object Tool. Watch what happens if I get it to show up. Click on the box. Is it going to work? I don't know why it's not working today. That's cool. And apparently all my buttons are disabled. Well, that's nice. I'm going to pretend like this is working. You guys can try it. Is anyone able to hit that and it's actually doing something? Mine's like locked for some reason. Yeah, it's supposed to. The way it's supposed to work, we're going to pretend like this is working. I click on the button. It turns blue, like any other button does. And when you hit it, if you click on an object in your render, it selects it in the viewport. Mine is not doing that. I don't know why, but usually it works. So let's just kind of zoom in and look at this one area here. So this is my cropped render of that section. That's way better than what I had before, now that I've kind of let it finish. That only took a few seconds. It looks pretty good, but let's just pretend that you guys do the cropped render and it's still grainy and you want to make it better. How could I, like looking at my render settings, what would you guys do if this still doesn't meet kind of what you're shooting for as far as like the overall quality? What would you guys end up jumping to?
I'm kind of guessing, but would it be the pixel variance?
That will affect it. If you guys end up playing with this one, and you probably haven't messed with this guy before. It's in Mental Ray. There was something called contrast in Mental Ray that was the same thing. This one is very dangerous if you don't know what it's doing, because a lot of people assume if you make a number bigger, it means something's better. I'm going to put this way over to like up here, because that's probably a good call. And we're going to hit R to render this again. Let's see what happens now that I've cranked up pixel variance. See how fast that finished? There's my masterpiece. We have made this thing way worse. Because what the pixel variance does is it basically, like, so when you kind of look at this thing, see how it says there's a min and a max samples? So at the minimum, a pixel uses no samples at all. At the max, a pixel uses 128. That's a big range, right? This guy right here, that's the number that helps the pixel figure out how many samples it uses between those two numbers. It's sort of like a threshold or a contrast slider. A lower number makes it probably use closer to the max samples. I would recommend for you guys, since you probably don't know enough about this yet, to not mess with that at all. Just leave it the way it is. A lot of people, though, want to change this guy, just raising the max up to make the image cleaner. This will work. Now, if you're going to raise the max up, do this in, usually you raise it in powers of 2, like 128, 256, you double that to 512, 1024. But it's really easy to crank that up too high, and before you know it, you've got like a 40-minute render on something that's just very simple. So I would say for your project, if you kind of want to write this down, try doing the render with 128 and just see what it looks like. And if you think that it's not clean enough, just double it to 256 and try rendering it again. But look at those numbers for the rays every time I bump this up. That is 663 million samples at 128. If I go to 256, I'm now into 1.3 billion samples. So that means it's going to take longer. It's telling you how many samples total are going to hit the full image. So this will probably clean it up. Now, if you think that at 256, it's still grainy, I just don't want you guys to keep going up higher and higher, and just because that's going to cause your render times to be atrocious this month. If you think you have to go higher than 256 just for the lights, I would not go higher. Instead, what I want you guys to do is down below this area, go into the integrator. And you're going to see this is set to something called VCM. We're not going to get into hardly any of this stuff. You can look it up in the help docs. It's a lot of math. That's very boring. But the main thing with this is under VCM, there are two really important sliders at the top. Light samples and BXDF samples. What do you think that probably does, just by the name? I mean, you guys know what samples are, right? What do we say samples were?
That's determines the quality.
Yeah. It's just like a calculation, like a little dot. Like the more samples you have, the more accurate the image looks, even though it takes longer. So this means when you crank this up, you're making all the samples in the scene jacked up to make the render a lot slower. This guy only affects the light samples, which means you can actually fix the grain on the light, because that's all we have in the scene right now, are a bunch of lights anyway. I could probably clean up the grain with this just by bumping it up to like 2 or 3, and there's a good chance this would give me a way quicker render time without having to crank that guy up super high. So anything beyond 256, I would just say come down here. Just try raising your light samples to like 2, 3, or 4. You're going to notice the render time doesn't really change very much, but it's going to clean up a lot of this, this noise. So, I mean, this is what we had at 1. I'll just try going to like 4. How long did that take last time? Yeah, I'll load up the inspector real quick. That was 20 seconds. Let me try rendering it again. And I'll see how long this one takes. Hey, what's up, man? You got class in here next? All right. So this thing's almost done. It's not really that much slower, but let's kind of let that finish. Okay, so I went from, let me zoom in here, 20 seconds. All I did is boost up the light samples, and I went pretty high. I went from like 1 to 4. You may only go from like 1 to 2. And that went up to about 30 seconds, which is not that bad. And I know it's kind of hard to see in the, wow, you can't see anything on the projector. Can you see that grain changing? This projector's terrible. Yeah, you can't see anything on it. On my screen, it is a dramatic difference. I hate this projector. Just take my word for it. It's really grainy when I'm looking at it right here, and I'm looking at the second one, and it is super smooth. So it is a big difference in quality at hardly any render hit. But once you guys get like that, the worst part of the render, you know, cropped and exactly the way you want it, and it's clean, that's when you can just, you know, go back here. I'm going to remove the crop. Let's get rid of that. Get rid of the crop. And this is where you basically just look through the camera, hit render current frame, make sure it starts, and then you can just step away for a few minutes, you know, relax, and just let this thing, you know, calculate. But I mean, your renders probably shouldn't take more than maybe 15 minutes, I'd say at this point. They're going to become longer as we start building materials, but the lighting phase for today, the renders shouldn't really be too bad. All right, I'm just going to kill that, not let that go. So that is pretty much everything you're going to be doing today. Just getting comfortable with RenderMan, loading in your lights, and you're going to try to do your best to match that image right there. But as long as you guys follow the documentation and kind of use the same techniques we talked about, you should be able to get this thing working pretty well. And we'll kind of help you guys through that as you get started in the lab. Sound good? Great. All right, we're going to kill the recording on this one.